Okay, now, giving all those great benefits, including 1 trillion years instead of even their original 2 billion years, or even in my initial illustration, 10 billion years, we're going to give them 1 trillion years with all these benefits of impossible good mutations, 1 out of 2, happening 200 times a second to all these. If you had that many organisms all over the surface of the Earth, you'd have not an overpopulation problem, you'd have a mess. I mean, it would just, ugh. You couldn't walk through it. Okay. But the odds against it happening are, in 1 trillion years, are 100 million billions to 1 against it happening. 100 million billions. Do you understand what that means?
I used to when I was a kid.
It means that you would have to do what we described, all these things over and over again, all these 200 per second mutations with 1 billion on every square foot of the whole surface of the Earth for 1 trillion years. You'd have to do each one of those experiments for 1 trillion years 100 million billion times. Okay? So statistically, for it to happen, the time span would have to be not 1 trillion years. It would have to be 100 billion trillions of years to maybe have it happen. And that's for a simple 200 part, huh? That's for one thing to go from 1 part to 200 parts, which is not even a complete cell in the human body. Okay, now, we're not talking about the evolution of a horse. We're not talking about the evolution of a mouse. We're not talking about the evolution of even a human cell in our body. Or what? We're not talking about the evolution even of a germ, of a bacterium. We're talking about the simplest possible imaginable thing that we're talking about to have it happen statistically. And that doesn't mean it would happen, of course. But statistically, to say you had enough time and enough chances for it to maybe happen, you'd have to have 100 million billion trillion years of time for it to happen under those more than ideal circumstances that I just described. And that's for this little teeny 1 part thing going to a 200 part thing. It has nothing to do with anything else that's going on. How could anybody believe that evolution happened? Because they prefer to believe it.
Isn't there, they say statistically, when you get beyond a certain number, it's just basically impossible.
That's right.
And that is not anywhere near that high.
That's right. That's right. Oh, the number at which, in real life, statistical probability becomes actually an impossibility is way, way lower than anything we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about numbers that so far exceed what they mean when it statistically becomes impossible instead of merely probable or having any probability. I mean, these numbers are so many times more. We're talking about millions and billions and trillions of times more than the number that they say it becomes impossible. So that's why I said even though it wouldn't necessarily happen, and indeed it wouldn't happen, just to have enough time for it to happen on paper would be 100 million billions of trillions of years. And who can even... They are so limited in their imaginations that they haven't even been able to come up with anything more than max 20 billion years for the age of the universe. Now, they've done that because they thought, well, if they just given enough time, anything can happen. Well, the fact of the matter is, given enough time, it can't happen. It cannot happen. I don't care how much time you give it. And none of them have even postulated that kind of time frame. But they do postulate the time frames they do, figuring that they can buffalo most people into believing it because billions of years sounds like so much. So it is so utterly absurd that sometimes I wonder why we even bother to discuss it. But oddly enough, we still do need to discuss it. Most Christians are still persuaded by this stuff. All right, let's look now at the whole issue of fossils and fossil evidence and fossils found in the layers of the earth. And this is always pointed to as, the great evidence of evolution. We have, as we look through geology and paleontologists who dig into layers of the earth looking for fossils, etc., we've found that there are layers in the Earth's crust that the layers are differentiated. I mean, you can tell where there's different layers that were formed at some time somehow. It's not just all one solid homogeneous mass. There are differences in the layers. And these strata or layers contain, often, fossils that are in these various layers, evidencing some life form that died and was fossilized in that layer at some time in the past. Now, many evolutionists claim that fossils are the best evidence for evolution. However, there's more and more evolutionists today, not by any means a majority or even close to it, but there's other evolutionists that admit that that's a gross overstatement of the facts, some of the more honest ones. But most evolutionists that you will ever talk to, you probably in your lifetime might ever find one that wouldn't say that the fossil record is great evidence for evolution. But they will hold it up as the evidence and proof of evolution. Well, here, we've found it. In fact, years ago when one of the men from our church who had gone to a Christian school here in town, a Christian high school, and he quit supporting the school when he realized that he had been taught evolution there when he went there, and he stopped supporting it as an alumni because of that, and the president of the school, happened to be a friend of his, got a little upset about that when he got the letter saying he wasn't going to support him anymore because of evolution. He said, "We don't teach evolution." And so Dave said, "Oh, yes, you do." And make a long story short, Dave was asked to come in and have a meeting with the president and the 2 biology teachers of the school and with 2 or 3 board members. And Dave asked if he could bring me along. So the 2 of us went and had a meeting with these people. And one of the biology teachers said that he didn't take a stand. He presented both sides. He presented creation and he presented evolution. He let the students pick, and he remained unbiased, to which one of the board members said to him, "I'm amazed at your incredible ability to be unbiased and to just be so neutral and to present both sides of the story without any bias whatsoever. I'm really amazed." Then he paused and he says, "I don't respect it, but I'm amazed." The other biology teacher, instantaneously, he didn't pussyfoot. He didn't say, "Ooh, I better try to hide what I really believe." He came right out and admitted that he believed in evolution. I don't even know if he said he believed God did it. But he says this school happens to be near the Mississippi River, and of course the big bluffs down to the Mississippi River allow you to look at some layers. He says, "I just take the students down there and I show them those layers and those fossils, and they have to believe in evolution." He says that's all there is to it. When I get done showing that, they believe in evolution, because there it is. And that's not an unusual position for these evolutionists to take that kind of a incredibly dogmatic stand that fossils and layers prove evolution. Now, creationists, of course, maintain that the fossil record provides a lot of evidence against evolutionism. In fact, showing that life hasn't evolved, but that animals have merely diversified within basic, clear, and separate types. Now, I want to talk again just in general about the layers and the fossil record, so you'll understand the groundwork here. There is a tendency, an inconsistent tendency, for fossils to be found in specific groupings. Now, there's a tendency on the one hand to find, for example, marine animals found buried together. Certain reptiles and dinosaurs have been found together, mammals found together, etc., in these general groupings. But even though there's that tendency on the one hand, there's all kinds of inconsistencies to that where it isn't true and where they're all mixed up. But because there is that tendency, and there's a lot of places that they can say, "Oh, here's another example of it." When I say a lot, I don't mean that it's even the majority necessarily, but it's enough they can say, "Oh, look at. You know, with all the fossils and layers that are out there, you could say, look at all day long and just show the ones that fit your theory and never even mention the others. But these general groupings of types of creatures in fossil beds are called geologic systems or geologic periods. A particular layer that contains certain types of fossils is called a geologic period. The groupings are occasionally found in vertical order within the sedimentary layers, So you've got a layer with a grouping and another layer on top of that with a grouping, etc. And this order of layers is called it's the so-called geologic column. Okay, you've heard of the geologic column. If you look in the Time Life series or any of these books that talk about evolution, they'll give you a drawing, a picture, a graph, whatever, showing all these layers with names and the types of animals that are in each of these layers. And it's an idealized grouping of the general systems into a single vertical stacked series. Well, the Grand Canyon has about 5 of these geologic periods in it, and it's a mile deep. It varies. Some of them are thin, some of them aren't there at all, some of them are thick. It'll vary. Okay? But did you hear what I said in describing this? It's if you just kind of stack them up, then you get this geologic column. I will come back to that in a moment. Evolutionists interpret these groupings in terms of the evolutionary model. They look at these groupings, they look at these layers, they look at the fossil evidence, and they interpret what they see according to their evolutionary model. They believe there was once an age of fishes, an age later of reptiles, a later age ultimately of mammals and man. Okay, that's their belief system. And they look at the fossil record and they interpret the observations they make according to that. And I'll just tell you right now this. The fossil record is a fact. We're not here to say there's no fossil record. What they do with the fossil record, the way they describe it and interpret it and stack it up in their books, that, of course, is not a fact. That's their interpretation of the observations and facts. It's indeed a manipulation of the facts, such as stacking up those layers all into a column in a book, saying here's the geologic column. You get the impression, most students, if you just ask them from what they've read in their books, if they had the capacity to go out and dig down through the whole Earth's crust, they would believe that they would find all these layers in that precise order everywhere they went. That isn't true, of course, but it's in the book. Okay? Now, they interpret this again, these observations. They say, well, there's a layer, and there's some creatures that were fossilized in it. Here's another layer, and there's creatures fossilized in this. They interpret this according to their evolutionary model. We as creationists, on the other hand, we insist that the evidence there is grossly insufficient to establish that, to be consistent with their evolutionary model and to establish their point of view. We believe that the little order that does exist in the fossil record is primarily due to burial of successive ecological zones during and after the worldwide flood of Noah. Here's a quote from apparently a Russian, so I can't pronounce his name very well, but it's Valentin Krassilov, I believe is how you pronounce that, in an article called Causal Biostratigraphy, or maybe stratigraphy, I don't know. Anyway, in a magazine, Lathea, which is some foreign magazine. But anyway, he said this: it is worth mentioning that continuous evolutionary series derived from the fossil record can in most cases be simulated by chronoclines. Hang with me. That is, successions of a geological cline population. I'll explain what those terms mean in a moment. Successions of a geological cline population imposed by the changes of some environmental gradients. Now, I looked up, I didn't know what a cline was either, so I looked that up in the dictionary. A cline is a gradual variation in a particular inherited characteristic found across a series of adjacent populations of a group of related organisms. What that means is that a cline has within it variation in related creatures. Okay? And it's an ecologically determined thing. So he's saying that these things grouped according to some ecological factor explains why you find them either in a layer or in successive layers when you do. Yes?
So in other words, all the similar ones should be in each period?
Well, if their evolutionary model would be correct, each period should have all the similar organisms in it and the differences would only be found in the different ones would be found successfully in other layers as they evolve from that into something else. Yes. But when you do, and I underline this, it's only when you do find these large groups of similar organisms all in one layer, say, oh, this simpler life form we find in these lower layers down here. Why is that? Well, number one, it could be an ecological thing. Let's look at it this way. If creatures tend to hang together, schools of fish. When you find schools of fish, you don't find schools of a myriad different fish all together. You find schools of tuna, schools of these different fish that are alike in one area together. They tend to, birds of a feather flock together, right? When we get doves out here, we usually get a whole group of doves. The crows hang out together. Well, if they're going to be devastated in some way that results in their death and burial, it's going to largely, therefore, be because of their ecology in a group. Okay? That's one thing. The other thing is this, and I don't have a direct quote on this, but I'll mention this. They have found that simpler organisms, like kind of round things with no legs sticking out of them, for example, that would be simple compared to something that's got a bunch of legs sticking out of it. Simple organisms compared to more complex organisms, if you put them in water and silt and shake them all up in a tube, so you get them all mixed up, they will tend to settle out in the tube, starting from the less complex at the bottom to the more complex at the top. There's a tendency to that. All right? So where, in fact, you find these supposed successive layers of simple in the lower layers and progressively more complex in the upper layers, therefore the later or less old layers versus the lower, older layers, and we all agree this, where you have undisturbed layers, the bottom layer was laid down before the up layer above it. Okay, we agree with that. How long that took, of course, is where there's a big difference of opinion. But nevertheless, I'm saying with our flood geology, believing that the layers that are there in the fossil records are the result of the flood, then it's a mechanical fact that organisms that are all stirred up in this flood, when settling starts to occur, they do tend to settle out with the more complex being the last ones to settle out. And they would therefore tend also to group in less complex to more complex. Yeah.
When you say complex, you mean more like dense as far as weight?
I'm using the word complex in terms of shape and, function. Look at a bacteria. It's kind of basically like this cell, and it hasn't got a bunch of things sticking out of it. Now you take a spider with all these legs sticking out of it. Okay, that's more complex than that little bacteria. Also, you've got the fact that there's, relatively speaking, there is not very much fossilized evidence of human beings. Okay, of course, their argument is that, well, man is such a late comer. There's not many fossils. But we have to raise the question as creationists with the flood and all life creatures being created in the same 6-day period. Though man was the last, there was no death prior to that, so all creatures lived at one time together on this earth. When the flood came, how come we have so few fossilized remains of people compared to all these other creatures?
Maybe we just haven't found them yet.
Okay, number one, maybe we haven't found them yet, but a more likely explanation is this. The more intelligent the creature, the better it will tend to survive in trying to escape the onslaught of some devastating crisis. Okay? The flood did not, on the first day, in the first hour, kill everybody or everything. So as man would start moving to higher and higher ground and trying to get away, men would be overall some of the last to be annihilated by the flood, and their bodies would have been floating on the water and decaying and not being fossilized as much as the vast animal populations that would have been more easily devastated by this, with the lower intelligence, etc., and not having the natural ability to escape as well. And the higher animal forms, I'm using the term higher in the evolutionary sense for the moment. The simpler life forms versus the higher life forms, even the higher life forms that are below man, man being the highest life form, those that are below man would are more intelligent and better able to survive overall than the lower life forms, quote unquote, beneath them. And so there's another explanation for why you might have a certain density of things in one type of creature as opposed to another type of creature, and why I believe man is, in the fossil record, less dense than the others. Plus the fact that man's population would be a fraction of the animal population. The animal population, I believe, would have been much greater and much more vast than the human population.
Where do you find fossils?
You find fossils in...
Other than underground, where do
you don't find them anywhere but underground.
you find them under ocean?
Okay, I see what you mean. Anywhere there's sedimentary rock or sediments, there can be fossils. So yes, if we got under oceans, yeah. Pardon me? Well, you can find them in caves, but not just laying out loose, okay, unless they've been somehow eroded away and exposed. All right, let's press on here. Here's another quote now from David Ropp, who has a PhD from Harvard University. He's curator of geology at the museum of the Field Museum in Chicago. That's where I used to go as a kid every year for the trip to the museum. And we got to see all the evolutionary things, got to see all the cavemen, you know, the Neanderthals and all behind the glass in their little environments where they lived. Every year we go see all that stuff, and you go in, and the first thing you see, these huge dinosaur skeletons, the Brontosaurus and all these things. It was just phenomenal. Okay, and anyway, he was former professor of geology at the University of Rochester. He pointed out that there is actually little or no real orderly progression in the fossils which creationists need to accommodate in constructing flood geology theories. In other words, the vast majority of the fossil record is not something we have to explain. It's a relatively insignificant portion of the total fossil record that has order in it which we have to offer an explanation for. And if you look at their uniformitarian views, most of it should be orderly. But indeed, most of it is not. Most of it is chaotic. Okay? Now, the geologic column, I said before, they put it in books, they stack it up and put it in books. It's really more of a concept than an actual reality. Here's a quote from an eminent evolutionist by the name of Edmund Speaker, in which he admits in an article in the Bulletin of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, in an article called Mountain Building and Nature of Geologic Time Scale. He says this, "No, I wonder how many of us realize that the time scale was frozen in essentially its present form by 1840. In other words, whatever time scale they've been working with, they've pretty well been working with it since 1840. Now, that's overall. I've indicated to you that I've seen things age in my lifetime by millions of years. Okay, that's true. Like man, they used to say man's about 1 million years old. Now he's up to about 5 million years old. The age of the Earth has gotten older too. But the overall basic framework is pretty much the same. He says, how much world geology was known in 1840? Now he's making the point that the basic framework of time was set back as early as 1840. It was already basically set. And they didn't know that much about world geology at the time. He says a bit of Western Europe, none too well, and a lesser fringe of North America, that's about all they knew. All of Asia, Africa, South America, most of North America were virtually unknown geologically. How dared the pioneers of this theory of evolution assume that their scale would fit the rocks in these vast areas? By far, most of the world. So in other words, they have these rocks and fossils from a few isolated areas, relatively speaking. He's saying they're presumptuous to assume that it would apply everywhere, but they have applied it everywhere. Only in dogmatic assumption, he says, a mere extension of the kind of reasoning developed by Werner from the facts in his little district of Saxony. It's a place in France, I believe. And in many parts of the world, notably India and South America, it does not fit. But even there it is applied. They apply it in places it doesn't actually fit the actual evidence. The followers of the founding fathers went forth across the earth and in Procrustean fashion made it to fit the sections they found, even in places where the actual evidence literally proclaimed denial. So flexible and accommodating are the facts of geology, unquote. Now, this is a guy who believes in evolution, but he thinks that they're playing games with the record. Some, again, tend to be honest, even though they, bottom line, still believe in evolution. The vast majority of the Earth's surface does not have most of the geologic periods appearing in correct consecutive order as required by evolution. Most of the Earth's surface does not have most of the geologic periods. Here's a quote from John Woodmorape, obviously is an Englishman. A name like that can only come from England. He says this. Now, this is from an article he wrote called The Essential Non-Existence of the Evolutionary Uniformitarian Geologic Column, a Quantitative Assessment. He published this in the Creation Research Society Quarterly. That's a serious scientific periodical, the Creation Research Society Quarterly. It's hard to read. I used to subscribe to it. I couldn't even understand most of what I read, and I finally just quit. But he says this: 2/3 of the Earth's land surface has only 5 or fewer of the 10 geologic periods in place. 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface. Now, he started out saying 2/3 they have 5 or less at all. Then he says 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface do not even have 3 geologic periods appearing in correct consecutive order. Okay? So 2/3 of the Earth doesn't even have more than 5. And within that, it's either 5 or less. And 80 to 85% of the Earth's surface doesn't even have more than 2 in any proper order. Proper order meaning according to the evolutionary view. He says a significant percentage of every geologic period's rocks does not overlie rocks of the next older geologic period. In other words, here's this old geologic period. The one above it's supposed to be younger, so this is supposed to be older. He's saying that a significant percentage of geologic periods of rocks do not overlie rocks of the next older geologic period. Some percentage of every geologic period rests directly upon Precambrian basement. Now, there's a period called the Cambrian period. That's the oldest period of biological life. The Precambrian period is bedrock upon which all the fossil layers with fossils have supposedly been laid. Okay? What he's saying is that every geologic period has places where it's found directly laid on bedrock, on the Precambrian rock, with nothing in between. Now, that's a fact, but the evolutionists they don't put that in their books. They may talk about it in their conferences and try to figure it out, but they don't put it in the textbooks that the students get. Yeah.
Is the bedrock layer, is that consistent throughout the whole world? Is it a particular type?
First of all, I believe it is a type. I don't know enough about that stuff to give you a solid answer on that, but I know this. It's a layer of rock in which you shouldn't find any fossils, and it's not sedimentary.
The water table would have to be above that, though.
No, there's water beneath that surface, down beneath that part of the crust of the Earth too. That's where the fountains of the deep came from when they broke open. But it wouldn't contain water running through it, probably, as such. Okay, he says, since only a small percentage of the Earth's surface obeys even a significant portion of the geologic column, it becomes an overall, as opposed to the whole thing. Nothing obeys all of it. Only a small part of the Earth's surface obeys even a significant portion of the geologic column, so-called. It becomes an overall exercise of gargantuan special pleading and imagination for the evolutionary uniformitarian paradigm, frame of reference, to maintain that there ever were geologic periods. The claim of their having taken place, geologic periods having taken place, to form a continuum of rock lifetime of 10 biochronologic onion skins over the Earth is therefore a fantastic and imaginative contrivance. Now, that's a lot of fancy words to say that the whole thing is made up. It's not a reality. The whole thing about the geologic column and all is... No. He's a creationist, but the guy has written tons of stuff. He's a great researcher. He's got all kinds of documentation for his claims against their interpretation of the fossil record. Here's a quote from a geologist who is a Christian and a creationist by the name of Stephen Austin, who has a PhD in geology. He says there's 10 common misconceptions about the geologic column. He states that the evidence is clear and overwhelming that none of the following beliefs is true. 1, and we'll be talking more about these various points, not probably all of them, but not necessarily, but we'll comment on each one a little bit as we go. But some of them we'll be talking about more after I go through this list. He states the evidence is clear and overwhelming that none of the following beliefs is true. These are beliefs held by evolutionists about the geologic column. 1, the geologic column was constructed by geologists who, because of the weight of evidence that they had found, were convinced of the truth of uniformitarian theory and organic evolution. In other words, they believe, evolutionists believe that the geologic column was constructed by people that were compelled to construct it based on the evidence itself. He's saying that is false. Now, some of what we already talked about demonstrates that. Number 2, this is also false. Geologists composed the geologic column by assembling the periods and eras which they had recognized. That isn't true because it isn't based on that. It's actually based on their evolutionary philosophy in the first place. They constructed it sitting down and taking layers, saying, well, this obviously layer belongs here because it's got the simple form of life in it. It's not from an actual observation in the field that they concluded these things. It's based on evolution they concluded these things. 3, the strata systems of the geologic column are worldwide in their occurrence, with each strata system being present below any point on the Earth's surface. In other words, everywhere you go on the Earth, you dig down, you find this geologic column. Like I said, that's what most students would believe. Not true. And as the figures we just quoted from Woodmere clearly indicate that that's not even close to true. By the way, there is nowhere in the world that you even in one place have the whole geologic column. Not even one place. 4, strata systems always occur, this is another false belief, strata systems always occur in the order required by the geologic column. You have the geologic column in the book, you go out, you dig around, you discover that there's all kinds of layers that are out of order, that are supposed to be here above another one, and they're reversed, and some of them are the whole stack is sometimes reversed when there is a stack of any number of layers representing allegedly different eras. There's just the vast majority of the evidence is for a mixture and things that are contrary to the evolutionary sequence if you hold the uniformitarian evolutionary view. 5, fifth false belief. Because each strata system has a distinctive lithologic composition. Litho refers to rock, particular kind of rock composition. A newly discovered stratum can be assigned easily to its correct position in the geologic column. It's not true. Okay, in other words, everywhere you go, you find a particular layer of rock. You say, "Oh, that's automatically this particular age or period that fits in the column." It turns out not to be true. 6, another false belief. Fossils, especially the species distinctive of specific systems, provide the most reliable method of assigning strata to their level in the geologic column. In other words, if you find a particular fossil in a particular bed, layer of rock, because that fossil's there, you can automatically stick it in a certain place in the geologic column because of that fossil being there. That's how they largely do it, but that is not valid, as we'll see. We're running out of time, so we'll see a lot of this next week. 7, sedimentary evidence proves that periods of... This is a false belief. Sedimentary evidence. Sedimentary are layers laid down by water. Silt and all the stuff that's been in water, and then it settles out and creates a layer. Sedimentary evidence proves that periods of millions of years duration were required to deposit individual stratosystems. In other words, every layer is the evidence of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years of gradual laying down of sediment to create a layer. Well, that's a totally false belief. It doesn't happen that way. 8. Radiometric dating, that's these radioactive forms of dating like uranium, lead, and these other things. Radiometric dating can supply absolute ages in millions of years with certainty to systems of the geologic column, systems or periods in the geologic column. That's a false belief. We'll be talking next week or the week after about radiometric dating and what it can and cannot do. And that indeed, I'll be reading you some quotes that indicate that even the evolutionists that are honest admit that there's no absolute dating comes from the radiometric dating. 9. The environmental, this is another false belief, the environmental pictures, quote-unquote, assigned to certain portions of the geologic column, in other words, when you open up your Time Life series book and you see a particular period and they've drawn a picture about the environment and all, the environmental pictures assigned to certain portions of the geologic column allow us to accurately visualize what its geologic ages were like. In other words, if you believe they have accurately painted a picture of what it was like, then you say, oh, that's what it was like. Or you go to the museum and you look at the Neanderthal man walking around by his cave, you say, oh, that's what it was like. It's just like when they take these bones of fossilized men and they put, by drawing or by making a model, they put skin and hair and features on these things. Oh, that's what it looks like. We'll be talking later, in the next few weeks, about that. That's totally up to the artist. It has nothing to do with reality, and there's no basis for their environmental pictures being demonstrative of their geologic ages. That's just not true. The last one he says is the geologic column and the positions of fossils within the geologic column provide proof of amoeba to man, or of evolution. That's simply false. It doesn't provide proof of it at all. Not even remotely. Now, even the walls of the Grand Canyon is this great canyon that's been cut out, and you can see the layers right there. You don't have to dig them up. They're right there. You see all these layers. The walls of the Grand Canyon include only about 5 of the 10 geologic periods. The creationists don't generally believe that most of the layers are actually missing, the ones that aren't there, that they're missing. They believe these layers simply never existed. Some say that the evidence indicates that the sedimentary layers of the Grand Canyon were actually laid more or less continuously during truly massive flood conditions. That's the creationist position that we have, is wherever you have these layers, they're just the result of the flood conditions laying down the layers. In the case of the Grand Canyon, some water in a short period of time cut out the canyon while those layers were still soft. Now, all rock systems include gaps in the sequence that's expected by evolutionists. There's no place where they got the whole thing with no gaps. There's gaps everywhere they go. There are fundamentally missing layers that represent hundreds of millions and maybe billions of years gone, you know. Here's a quote from Science News. There was no author listed with it, but it's an article called Mountain Building in the Mediterranean. News of the Week section under Marine Biology in Science News said this: in many places, the oceanic sediments of which mountains are composed are inverted, with the older sediments lying on top of the younger. So when you look at the layers that make up a mountain, more often than not, the layers at the top are actually the younger, quote-unquote, layers, supposedly younger layers, the ones that they deem younger every place else, and the older ones are down underneath. It's common to find layers in orders which contradict the proper evolutionary sequence. We've alluded to this time and time again. Okay.
About the mountain, that they're inverted, or are they older layers on the top and younger layers on the bottom, or younger layers on the bottom?
I think I misspoke. Thank you for calling. I just realized I might have misspoken. What I'm saying is, on the top, you should expect the younger layers. Okay, The older ones are on top and the younger ones are on the bottom in a lot of the mountains. That's what I meant to say. Thank you for recognizing that I got that backwards. Okay, it's common to find layers in orders which contradict the proper evolutionary sequence. And just for a reference on that, if you want to get an article from the Creation Research Society Quarterly by John Woodmarape again, he wrote an article called The Anthology of Matters Significant to Creationism and Diluviology, which has to do with the deluge, the flood. In this article, just as an article, not a book, he includes a list of over 200 published instances of anomalously occurring fossils that are just totally in the wrong place and the wrong time if you hold evolution. In one article, he's got 200 published examples, things he's taken that have been published. Okay, what? Thought I heard somebody say something. All right, we're just about out of time, but I'll just get into this next section here, and we'll pick up with this next week. This is where it gets really exciting. Dating the geologic periods, the 10 geologic periods. How do the evolutionists date most fossils? How, for example, they determine the date of a dinosaur bone? They find a dinosaur bone, how do they date it? Now, we'll be talking later about things like radiometric dating and all that stuff and what it has to do with it, but we believe, of course, that dinosaurs became extinct if they did. Okay, I don't happen to believe that dinosaurs are extinct. I think there's still living dinosaurs at various places of the world. They're smaller than they used to be because dinosaurs are reptiles. They used to live for hundreds and hundreds of years, and reptiles grow as long as they live or as long as their environment allows them, if their environment is adequate to allow them to grow. So the big creatures that we see in these great dinosaurs from the quote-unquote past, I believe we still have today, just in smaller forms, in various jungles in South America and Africa. But even if you hold the view that they became extinct, the evidence of a lot of death of the large dinosaurs, we believe, goes back to 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, commensurate with the time of the flood or later, between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. Actually, about so it'd be after the flood, which the flood was about 4,400 years ago. So it was sometime after the flood that they finally, most of them died out. There's a film by Paul S. Taylor called Footprints in Stone, in which he has demonstrated down at the Paluxy Riverbed in Glen Rose, Texas, the evidence of human footprints together with dinosaur tracks. So that clearly we have, we'll talk more about that stuff at a later time, but we clearly have the evidence of dinosaurs living at the same time as men. Modern men, quote unquote. The evolutionists claim that dinosaur extinction was complete 70, 80 million years ago. Obviously a vast difference between the evolutionary interpretation and the creationist interpretation. No one has ever scientifically proven the age of any fossil dinosaur remains. No one has ever scientifically demonstrated it. Virtually no fossils are assigned a date based on the radioactive age estimation system. The radiometric methods are not used to date fossils, whether they're dinosaurs or otherwise. There is presently no radioactive dating method which can be used to directly date a dinosaur bone or any other part of the dinosaur's body and to prove it to be tens of millions of years old. There simply isn't any. They don't have it. Now, we're out of time, so next week I'm going to pick up with a discussion of some comments about radiometric dating. We're going to get more into it later, but next week we'll begin with some comments about radiometric dating and the fact that these evolutionists admit that that's not how they date the fossils. They don't date the fossils with radiometric dating. I'll give you a clue how they date them. They date the fossils based on what they call index fossils. They date fossils by other fossils. If they have what's called an index fossil and they find that in a layer with another fossil, they automatically assume the other fossil is the same age as that index fossil. And they've got a false scheme about how old those index fossils are. And then the question is, how do they know how old those are? Well, it's as old as the rock they're in. We'll talk about that next week. I'm not letting the cat out of the bag on that right now. We'll talk about that next week. It gets very exciting. Now, if you found this in any way dull, next week it won't be quite as dull. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we do thank and praise you for this time we've had again to look at these matters. We thank you for the fact that the evidence continues to mount. There's absolutely nothing about evolution that we need to believe or even can believe, that we can simply believe what your word has indicated to us.